We are doing a deep dive today, and our mission is pretty clear. We're taking the entire contents of Chapter 5 from Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology, and we're going to distill it all down to the critical mechanism-based knowledge that you really need to have. We're not just, listing drugs. We're analyzing the entire chemical toolbox, the one used to treat psychosis, mania, and depression.
Mhm.
And we're focusing strictly on how these agents work, right down at the molecular level.
And that's so essential because, the old term antipsychotics is just, it's misleading. These days, these agents are used far more often for mood stabilization or for bipolar depression, even as augmentation for treatment-resistant unipolar depression, way more than for primary psychosis.
Right. So we're ditching that old term and embracing the mechanism first language. We're calling them D2 antagonists or D2 partial agonists because it's only by understanding the pharmacology that we can truly balance what works against the inevitable side effects for a patient.
Exactly. And the chapter lays it out perfectly. It organizes the whole strategy into 4 distinct mechanisms, all of them targeting dopamine D2 and serotonin 5-HT receptors. So historically, you start with pure D2 antagonism. That's the foundation. Then came the big breakthrough, combining D2 antagonism with 5-HT2A antagonism.
Right.
Third is what you call the Goldilocks approach. That's D2 partial agonism combined with 5-HT1A partial agonism. And finally, you have the really cutting-edge dopamine-sparing approaches like selective 5-HT2A antagonism.
Okay, let's unpack that. We have to start at the absolute foundation, right? D2 antagonism. This is where the whole story begins. Back in the 1950s, with that accidental discovery of chlorpromazine, it was an antihistamine of all things.
Serendipity is, it's just key to this entire field. The goal was sedation, but researchers quickly realized its antipsychotic action was tied to blocking dopamine D2 receptors. That accident established the core idea for treating positive symptoms, delusions, hallucinations. The whole hypothesis is that you have to reduce this hyperactivity of dopamine signaling.
And that hyperactivity is specifically in the mesolimbic pathway, which the book has a great visual for. It shows it as being bright red with excess dopamine.
That's it. It's a great image. So you block those D2 receptors, and you're essentially turning down the volume on that pathway. You're alleviating the positive symptoms.
So that's the therapeutic goal.
That's the goal. But here's the trade-off. It's the cost of doing business, as they say. Dopamine isn't just in one place. It regulates 4 major pathways. So when you throw a D2 antagonist into the system, you block D2 receptors everywhere, indiscriminately.
Yeah.
And that leads to this cascade of side effects in all the other pathways.
And that cascade is what makes or breaks a treatment. So let's map out that cost, pathway by pathway. Let's start right where we're trying to treat, the mesolimbic pathway.
Right. Even there, where the D2 blockade is therapeutic for psychosis, you're also hitting the nucleus accumbens. That's the brain's reward and motivation center. So blocking D2 there just suppresses normal motivation. It flattens reward processing. And that leads to what we call secondary negative symptoms apathy and hedonia. It's often called neuroleptic-induced deficit syndrome, or NIDS.
So it looks like schizophrenia, but it's actually the medication causing it.
Precisely. It's a devastating trade-off. You're treating one set of symptoms only to create another that just tanks quality of life.
It sounds like a massive clinical hurdle.
It is. Then you have the mesocortical pathway. Now, in schizophrenia, dopamine here is already thought to be hypoactive. So if you block D2 receptors here, you can actually worsen the intrinsic negative cognitive and affective symptoms. You're pushing it down where it's already too low.
Okay, now for the one that causes the really immediate physical changes, the tuberoinfundibular pathway.
Yes. The classic D2 side effect. Normally, dopamine acts as a brake on prolactin release from the pituitary. When you antagonize D2, you block that natural brake, prolactin goes up, you get hyperprolactinemia, and clinically you'll see things like galactorrhea, amenorrhea, gynecomastia, and the really serious one long-term is potential bone demineralization. It's not a trivial side effect at all.
Not at all. And finally, the pathway everyone associates with the older drugs, the nigrostriatal motor pathway.
The infamous motor side effects, people call it EPS, but that's, a bit imprecise. We need to be specific. We're talking about drug-induced parkinsonism, or DIP. We're talking about acute dystonia, those awful involuntary contractions, and akathisia, which is just this terrible intermotor restlessness.
Let's stick with DIP for a second because the mechanism is so illustrative. It's all about this balance, this sort of seesaw between dopamine and acetylcholine in the striatum.
It's a perfect example. So think of it like this. Dopamine, through D2 receptors, acts as a brake. It inhibits acetylcholine, or oxygeek, release. Oxygeeks is kind of like the accelerator for movement. So when you introduce a D2 antagonist, you cut the brake lines. that dopamine inhibition is gone and the HGH system is suddenly unleashed. You get this enhanced HGH release, and that's what causes the tremor, the rigidity of DIP.
So if the problem is too much A-sheet, the solution must be to block its receptors, the M1 receptors, to try and get that balance back, using anticholinergics like benztropine. But they have their own issues, right?
They absolutely do. They can fix the DIP, but they introduce a whole new set of problems. You get dry mouth, blurred vision, but centrally, you can get confusion and cognitive dysfunction. And that's especially a problem in older patients. The chapter points out that a lot of patients end up over-medicated. That's why alternatives like amantadine are sometimes preferred. It works differently, dampening the overall excitability of the motor circuit, and you avoid that heavy anticholinergic burden.
Okay, that covers the acute motor stuff. But then there's the long-term chronic problem, the one everyone dreads, tardive dyskinesia, or TD.
Yes, this is a profound neurological shift. TD happens after chronic D2 blockade.
Yeah.
The brain tries to compensate. It creates D2 receptor upregulation and supersensitivity. It's a form of neuroplasticity the brain is learning, and these new hypersensitive receptors pop up in the indirect motor pathway, which is the stop pathway.
So instead of having too much stop, like in Parkinsonism, the brain's overcorrection leads to the opposite problem.
Exactly. Now, when any little bit of dopamine hits those supersensitive D2 receptors, the stop pathway gets inhibited way too much. So the action flips. It results in too much go. And that's what gives you the hyperkinetic involuntary movements, the facial grimacing, lip smacking.
This is where modern pharmacology is just incredible, because now we have targeted treatments for this, the VMAT2 inhibitors.
A total game changer. It addresses the core problem without just blocking more D2 receptors. VMAT2 is the protein that packages dopamine into vesicles for release. So if you inhibit VMAT2, the dopamine can't get packaged. It just sits in the presynaptic terminal where it gets broken down by MAO.
So you're basically putting the whole dopamine system on a controlled diet. You're trimming the supply to compensate for the brain's overeager demand from those supersensitive receptors.
That's a perfect way to put it. It leads to this controlled depletion of presynaptic dopamine. And that trims the drive in both the motor pathways, which compensates for the D2 supersensitivity and reduces the TD movements. It's chemically elegant.
And that's where we see these complex names like deuterbenzene and valbenazine. What's the trick there? How are they better than the original, tetrabenazine?
It's all about improving the pharmacology. Tetrabenazine has a short half-life, so you need to dose it 3 times a day. The newer ones use chemical tricks to slow that down. Deuterbenzene swaps in heavy hydrogen atoms deuteration to protect it from being broken down so fast, so you get twice daily dosing. Valbenazine uses a different trick, a valine linkage that hydrolyzes slowly, and that gets you to once daily dosing. It's a huge improvement for patients.
Okay, now let's move to the second generation. This was a real breakthrough that changed everything, adding serotonin 5-HT2A antagonism to the D2 blockade.
Okay.
Why was that so revolutionary?
Because 5-HT2A antagonism acts like a counterbalance. See, serotonin 5-HT2A receptors often sit on other neurons, like dopamine neurons, and they regulate dopamine release. By blocking the 5-HT2A receptor, you're essentially removing an inhibitory brake, and that causes a disinhibition of dopamine release right where you need it most.
So you're adding dopamine back into the very pathways that the D2 antagonist was accidentally shutting down. That sounds like a delicate dance.
It is, but it works beautifully across 3 circuits. In the nigrostriatal motor pathway, 5-HT2A antagonism boosts dopamine release. That extra dopamine then competes with the D2 antagonist at the receptor site, which softens the D2 blockade and reduces motor side effects like DIP.
And I'm guessing the same thing happens in the mesocortical pathway, where dopamine was already too low.
Correct. You disinhibit dopamine release in the prefrontal cortex, and that can potentially improve those intrinsic negative and cognitive symptoms. It's a major reason these agents are so much better tolerated.
A huge benefit. What about the prolactin problem? Does it help with the hyperprolactinemia too?
It absolutely does. Serotonin itself actually stimulates prolactin release through 5-HT2A receptors. So when you block that 5-HT2A receptor, you cancel out the prolactin elevating effect from the D2 blockade. It helps keep prolactin levels much more stable.
Which brings us to the next big idea, D2 partial agonism, the Goldilocks drugs you mentioned.
Right. Partial agonism is all about finding that middle ground. The drug acts as a stabilizer. It's somewhere between full agonism, which is too hot, like in psychosis, and full antagonism, which is too cold, like in DIP. The clinical magic here is that the partial agonists for psychosis are designed to be very, very close to the antagonist end of the spectrum. They just have a tiny bit of intrinsic activity.
And that tiny bit is enough to stop the side effect cascade.
That's the key. That little whiff of activity is enough to stabilize the D2 receptor. It prevents the big motor side effects you get with a total shutdown. And here's the really cool part. In the pituitary, D2 partial agonists actually reduce prolactin because the cells there, the lactotrophs, are so sensitive that they treat that small bit of activity like as a full agonist. It completely reverses the effect.
Many of these also have 5-HT1A partial agonism. How does activating that receptor help?
It works through a slightly different door to get to the same room. Activating the 5-HT1A receptor, even partially, has similar downstream effects to blocking 5-HT2A. It enhances dopamine release in the motor pathway, which reduces motor side effects, and in the mesocortical pathway, which can improve mood. It's another tool to soften that D2 blockade profile.
Right. And as we said at the top, these drugs are used so widely outside of psychosis now. What are the main uses the chapter highlights?
Well, the list is long, but the big ones are mania, where the D2 antagonism helps tamp down that hypothesized excessive dopamine release. But the single biggest use today is for depression, both bipolar depression and for augmenting treatment in unipolar depression.
And how do they work for depression? Because it's usually at much lower doses, right?
Exactly. At those lower doses, the pharmacology completely shifts away from heavy D2 blockade. The therapeutic action comes from all the other binding targets. Things like 5-HT2A, 5-HT1A, 5-HT2C, 5-HT7 antagonism, even net inhibition in the case of quetiapine. All these other mechanisms work together to boost dopamine and norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex, which helps lift mood.
Before we look to the future, we have to talk about the biggest class warning sign of all, cardiometabolic risk. The book uses this powerful analogy of the metabolic highway.
And this is non-negotiable for anyone prescribing these. The highway is a progression. It starts with increased appetite and weight gain. That leads to obesity, which progresses to insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, especially elevated fasting triglycerides, then prediabetes, and ultimately, cardiovascular events and premature death. And the risk is very drug-specific.
And the mechanisms are more complex than just weight gain. There are two distinct things happening.
Yes. The first one is pretty clear with high-risk agents like olanzapine and clozapine. It's the strong H1 histamine and 5-HT2C antagonism that directly drives up appetite and weight. But the second one is more insidious. It's an acute increase in insulin resistance and triglycerides that happens before major weight gain. It suggests there's some unknown receptor X that just rapidly disrupts your metabolic function.
Which means you have to be constantly vigilant.
Constantly. The chapter really hammers this home. You have to monitor 4 things: weight BMI, fasting triglycerides, fasting glucose, and blood pressure. If your patient is on a moderate or high-risk agent, you have to track their journey on that highway and be ready to switch them or add something like metformin.
Okay, let's quickly touch on the different drug families, the pines, duns, and ripspips. What makes a few key examples unique?
Well, they share those core mechanisms, but all their secondary binding affinities create these unique personalities. You have clozapine, a pine, which is still the gold standard for efficacy, especially for treatment resistance and suicide reduction. But its unique risks, neutropenia, seizures, myocarditis, require really complex management.
Right. And what about a drug like quetiapine? It's known for being so versatile.
Quetiapine is a brilliant case of dose-dependent pharmacology. At low doses, it's the baby bear. It's basically just a sedative antihistamine. At mid doses, the mama bear, it becomes a robust antidepressant by adding net inhibition and hitting various serotonin receptors. And only at the highest doses, the papa bear dose, does it get enough D25-HT2A antagonism to actually work for psychosis.
And what about one of the newer agents, cariprazine? What's its special feature?
Cariprazine is a D25-HT1A partial agonist, but its claim to fame is its powerful D3 partial agonism. The D3 receptor is really concentrated in brain areas tied to emotion and cognition, so that D3 activity is thought to be why it shows superior efficacy for the really tough-to-treat negative symptoms of schizophrenia and why it's so effective in bipolar depression.
This is all fascinating. Let's end on the future because the field is moving so fast, trying to get away from direct D2 blockade altogether. What's the promise of TARA-1 agonists?
This is a major, major shift. TARA-1 agonists, like the compound 363856, don't block D2 receptors at all. Instead, they interact with the D2 receptor to bias its signaling. They kind of nudge the receptor toward the helpful inhibitory G pathway and away from the beta-arrestin pathway that's tied to side effects.
So you get the therapeutic effect of reducing dopamine signaling without paying the price of direct blockade.
That's the idea. It's an incredibly elegant way to try and normalize function. The other really exciting area is cholinergic agonists, targeting muscarinic M4 and M1 receptors with compounds like xanoline.
Yeah, what are those designed to do? The hypothesis is that M4 agonism can reduce psychotic symptoms, while M1 agonism might improve cognition. By targeting a completely different system, the cholinergic system, the hope is to get robust antipsychotic effects while completely sidestepping that whole cascade of dopamine-related motor and prolactin side effects we just spent all this time talking about. So, to wrap this massive chapter up, the complexity of these drugs is directly tied to their huge receptor profiles, D2, 5-HT2A, 5-HT1A, H1, and on and on. That profile dictates both their therapeutic use across psychosis and mood, and their very specific individual side effect profiles.
And we really have to internalize the fact that these are now foundational tools for mood disorders, which just reinforces why we need to think in mechanisms, not old labels. So here's the final thought this chapter leaves you with. Given the huge downstream effects we get from just tweaking one or two receptors at the start of a cascade, like with 5-HT2A antagonism, what other seemingly small modulations like TAR1 or M4 agonism could completely revolutionize how we treat complex brain disorders in the next decade? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.